Hello, everyone. With conferences being canceled and postponed, we knew we needed a way to connect with people, and we were missing those vital connections. Community is really important to us at Shopify, and we really want to find a way to connect with you in this virtual space. So we started Shipit, and it's our virtual event seminar series where we can get together and nerd out over the things that we're working on. Today, we're taking Burke's primer on Nix and showing you how we use it to rebuild our developer tooling. Yes, there's going to be demos. My name's Anita Clark, and I'm the editor of the Shopify's engineering blog. Joining me today is Burke. He's the staff Nixologist and a senior production engineer for the developer infrastructure team. Thanks for getting in the hot seat here, solo Burke. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, so as Anita said, I'm Burke. I'm, I guess, a production engineer technically, but a software developer at Shopify. I work on developer tools and have for quite a while. And yeah, I've been working with Nix a lot for the past year and a half. And I think, should I just launch into it? Or
Yeah, I was going to say, so Burke's going to go into a little presentation for us, and then he's got like a really great demo, and, pour your questions into the chat. Use the Q&A mode in the chat so we can see your questions and we'll get to them. Hopefully there'll be a lot of discussion because this is quite a popular post and people have been screaming, yelling, and discussing it politely also with people. So take it away, Burke.
All right. So yeah, the format of this is going to be, I'm going to kind of recap that blog post I did. I went back and forth on how much of educating about Nix versus showing how we're using Nix to do in this post. So what I ended up doing is I had this blog post presented kind of as a talk earlier, and I think I liked it better in talk format. I think it came across more clear, but in this format, I figured the real thing that I can do usefully is show you some of our developer tools and how we built them, how we use them. So what this is at the start here is just a quick recap of that blog post, basically. And I'm going to post an expanded version of this talk in a kind of like 25-minute format on my Nixology channel later today. So here's the abbreviated version. My assertion is that Nix can be the future of computing, period. But in order for that to happen, we have to find a way to explain it better. Nix is a thing that there's lots of little educational pieces about, like how to identify one little corner of Nix and use it successfully and feel comfortable with that. But I found that there's kind of like a lack of materials that really communicate to you like a deep intuitive feel for what Nix is and how to think about it. And from that bedrock, build up your understanding of the different components that you learn about. So the resources that do actually kind of communicate that intuitive sense tend to bring either kind of this energy, because they are literally Ilko's PhD thesis, or this kind of energy. And so, as you know, I published a blog post just the other day, which is why most of you will have registered for this. And like maybe according to a lot of the comments on Hacker News, I did both of those things. But regardless, the takeaway from that blog post and this talk in its abbreviated and to follow non-abbreviated versions are basically a basic conceptual scaffolding for how to think about Nix. So the basic fundamental idea in my mental model of Nix is that every single thing on your computer, all of the software, depends on other stuff on your computer. And normally that's not something you have to think about too much, or that you do think about too much, but Nix kind of forces you to confront that. So the key idea is that software is a graph of dependencies, and typically that graph is totally implicit, or different systems will carve out little pockets of explicitness, but overall the total system is very implicit. Nix forces you to make that whole graph structure explicit. So that's a very abstract concept, but this is what we'll try to develop. So software is a graph of dependencies. That graph is totally implicit. Nix forces you to make it explicit. All of it. So looking at this at the bottom here, you've got Ruby, and then all of the things that have to be in your system in order for that to run. That's all true whether or not you're using Nix. It's just that Nix actually accounts for that graph structure. So there's 4 things that you have to really understand in order to kind of grok Nix, I would assert. The language, the Nix store, the idea of a derivation, and the idea of sandboxing. And this is where this talk gets highly abbreviated. I'm going to dive into this in a lot more detail in a video that I'm going to post later. But briefly, so that we can get to the demos, the Nix store is a graph database that lives on your disk at the path /nix/store. And it contains a whole bunch of stuff. Every bit of software, lots of different components of building software go into the Nix store, and they all have relationships between each other. And this is kind of tracked on disk, and Nix just accounts for this. Basically, it's the thing that in acknowledgement of the fact that all software exists in this graph, it just models it as the graph. And it has all of these, nice attributes of the way it works. But for this recap level, we're going to skip it all. The derivation is the thing that puts things in the Nix store. So you have a derivation, and it's a file that includes the build instructions to construct a node in the Nix store. And how those get created in the first place, how the derivations get created, we'll talk about in a second. But basically, a derivation necessarily includes all of the dependencies of a prospective output path in the store. So the derivation mentions essentially the first level of the whole dependency closure, meaning that you can track from a derivation the entire history of what this piece of software would depend on if it would be built. And then Nix build tooling goes and takes that derivation and builds it. But that's kind of half of the story of building software. The other half is the sandbox. So where the derivation has to list everything that is actually used to build the software, sandboxing is how that's enforced. So when Nix builds are run, they're typically by default on a lot of platforms run in an actual sandbox that says, you only have access to these things that you've declared. So if you try to access things that weren't literally listed in that derivation as inputs or dependencies or some kind of something, when you try to access that file, it just fails. So this scheme allows Nix to build things and totally understand what was involved in that build process. And that allows it to maintain that graph database correctly, to understand what nodes connect to what nodes. And that gives you a lot of interesting powers like reproducible builds, portable builds, binary caching, all of these things that I'd love to talk about in more detail, but we're just going to gloss over all of it for right now. And of course, it's covered in more detail in that blog post too. So give that a good read if you haven't. The language is the thing that I could say the most about, but I'm going to say the least about. Nix has this really fascinating functional, lazy evaluated, almost side effect free language that's very perfectly tuned for creating these derivations and representing the relationships between them. So the flow here basically is you have the language where you represent, in code, the relationships between all of these different parts of your build process or a set of packages or whatever. That turns into a bunch of derivations. The Nix build tool builds those derivations using sandboxes, and ultimately they get put into the store. So that was all an extremely too fast overview of Nix, maybe a useful recap of that blog post if you've read it, but that's Nix. Let's move on to what we're doing with Nix, because this is what you're all probably here to see. So firstly, the kind of obvious wins is we've replaced, to back up briefly here, our developer tooling, our developer environments run on macOS and have for, ever, I guess. So we've always, for the last, 8 years or whatever, installed stuff with Homebrew. And we're, we started as a Ruby shop, so we do a lot of Ruby gems. So we've kind of replaced Homebrew sort of entirely and about half of the bundler Ruby gems pipeline with Nix, and that makes things a lot faster in a vast majority of cases. So that was kind of like a conceptually obvious thing to make to rebuild in Nix, and I'll show you a little bit of that working. But that's not nearly all we can do with Nix. There's a lot of power we can kind of unlock here. The concept of the Nix language and derivations gives us this really phenomenally powerful abstraction layer, this kind of conceptual barrier between defining your project and actually doing stuff with it. So the language is really expressive, but super limited in scope. And the outputs are like lazy evaluated and reproducible. And you can do some really cool things with that particular set of building blocks. So the thing that we're doing with that, or that we're prototyping right now, is called Runic. The basic idea of Runic is it's if you're familiar with NixOS, NixOS is a Nix module system for essentially declaring how your computer is set up. Runic is a Nix module system for declaring what a project is. So we try to have these extremely high level declarations of my project is Rails or something like this, and then have that bubble down into progressively finer levels of detail, things that you can toggle and configure and things like this, all the way down to the actual outputs, which could be development environment. A lot of these logos you won't recognize because they're Shopify internal tools. I could have changed this slide, but I didn't. Could be a developer environment, could run on Windows with WSL2, could run on Linux, could run on Mac OS, could generate CI pipelines, could generate Kubernetes manifests, could run in the cloud, could run locally, could generate a config for Railgun, our little virtual machine runner. So there's lots of stuff we can do when we specify a highly abstract definition of what a project is, where typically what you get in most, especially larger organizations with a larger number of tools around larger code bases, is you have the same information specified redundantly, but like viewed through a dozen or 24 different facets or lenses with slightly different windows in the same configuration. So Runic is kind of an effort to unify all that and derive it from a config rather than deriving it from our users' brains. And that's the end of the presentation. So now is essentially time to move on to live demo. So let's figure out how to do that. I'm going to turn on a screen share. Boom. Okay. So let's see. What should I show you? First thing I'm going to show you is just the way our dev tools work right now. So if I go to our core platform, this is our extremely large Ruby on Rails monolith. We have this tool called dev. So dev is a tool we've had since 2016, 2015. And I've started to think of it as kind of an API more than a tool. Our developers are very familiar with typing certain commands that do predictable things in the repository. So the typical workflow is somebody will clone a repository with, for example, dev clone Shopify, and that would take a while because it's a large repository. And then they'll run devup. And what devup does is to get absolutely everything ready in order that the next command, which will boot the project, should run. So here you can see this project profile thing is actually doing some Nix stuff, but we kind of hide it from the user. And now we're ready. So there's actually a whole lot of work that happens here the first time a user runs devup in a new repository, but on subsequent runs, it's quite fast because we go to pretty big effort to make it fast. We use a paradigm here. I hadn't planned to show you this, but I think I will. So in the dev code base itself, let's see, I'm going to go to install Nginx. Maybe it's called Nginx install. We use this paradigm of every single one of these dependency elements has a met and a meet. So when we go rip through this whole list of like stuff that has to be ready in order to boot the project, we first check met, is this thing met? Can we skip it? And then meet forces it to conform, and then we check met again to make sure, a basic sanity check. So the idea is that met should be, ideally singles, tens of milliseconds, because we evaluate quite a lot of them. So that's the basic paradigm of how dev works right now. Where was I going with this? So some of this is Nix already. But we mostly hide it from the user. we happen to have changed a little bit of the like package installation mechanism over to use Nix. But one thing you'll note is if you're familiar with Nix, you might expect me to have had to have run a Nix shell. I didn't, but still, if I type which Ruby, I have a Nix path, and if I do a read link of that, it'll be in the Nix store. So something's going on there about environment that I'll explain briefly. But first, let's talk about how dev is configured. So actually, first, let's talk about the rest of the API of dev. So if I run dev help, the kind of like basic API that we think of as like the big paradigm of interaction with all of our repositories that all of our users are super familiar with is moving around between projects with clone and CD, running dev up to just whatever the prerequisites and requirements are for this project, just satisfy them so the user doesn't have to think about it. Dev down, if dev up involved starting like processes or things like that, dev down will take them down to free up resources. And then dev run, open, test, console, server, and then additionally to this documentation, I should add style and type check are just the basic ways, and build are just the basic ways of interacting with your project. So these are things that people expect to work everywhere. You should expect in general to be able to run dev clone some other project and dev up and dev server, and that should universally work as long as it actually exposes an HTTP server to actually test. This has been a really fantastically useful paradigm for us for encouraging people to move around between projects and stuff, because in the days before dev, you would have these, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, you have these big, long prerequisite lists in your README, and it can sometimes take half a day, or sometimes even longer, to get a project actually running locally. So this is one of the really powerful things about our developer tooling that we've put a lot of effort into over the years. Another way that, like, one of the things that's most complicated about that is, well, let's run dev down. So this is going to shut down the processes that were started. So it turns out, I'm not going to talk about integrations really, but Railgun is a thing that we built too. So Shopify and most projects will depend on some number of data stores like MySQL, Redis, Memcached, Elasticsearch, things like this. And operating those on Mac OS can be a little challenging to start with. But then if you have, say, like different, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. If you have like different projects that depend on, say, different MySQL versions, you have a challenge, because like that gets just extra hard to run. And then you don't want the databases conflicting and stuff like this too. So we built this tool called Railgun, which gets run as part of DevUp, that is kind of like Docker Compose if you squint really hard. I like to jokingly refer to it as Docker Pre-Compose. But if I run Railgun start, it does this stuff. And so these are like kind of Docker containers, but it's sort of like from a fixed menu of you opt into the ones you want. And it, in theory, boots a little faster. But mostly the kind of like paradigm that we've really cared about with Railgun is when you support a whole bunch of developers, one of the biggest challenges is like debugging all of the unique and bizarre ways that things fail. So Railgun kind of collapses all of the possible failure modes of this fairly extremely high surface area set of services into, it's either running and it's fine, it's not running, or it's running and I don't know what's wrong, but I'll just clobber the whole thing and rebuild it. So we give users one very easy button to push to just go, I don't know, blow it up. And that's worked really well for a long time, as horrible as it sounds. And then, of course, Elasticsearch takes a very long time to start and doesn't always work. So that's kind of the tour of the pre-Nix developer tools at Shopify, I would say. But where it gets interesting as far as this topic goes is, let's look at dev YAML. So this is how dev is configured. We have the big dev code base that when you run dev up, it loads this file and figures out all the stuff it's supposed to do. So we don't have to worry about this stuff too much. First, I'm going to show you, just don't worry about the structure of this file, just look at the part I tell you. This is what the legacy config looks like before Nix. So we have this fairly what's the word? Sequential, procedural format where we do, okay, well, we've got Homebrew, and then we want to install all these packages. And then we want to install Phantom.js. And then we want to do GeoIP. And then we want to install Ruby with this version. And then we want to do some stuff about Bundler. And then we want to do some stuff about ImageMagick, some stuff about node packages, run a Railgun VM, more stuff about Bundler, database bootstrap, and so on. So what we kind of observed is that like a lot of this configuration is actually redundantly specified in, say, like our CI and production container build infrastructure and really all sorts of other places. So what if we could like bring this up a level in addition to like, let's just put it in Nix to make it faster. So the current config of this Shopify core, the monoliths dev YAML, is the up part you'll see is shorter. It's got GeoIP, Node, Railgun, and then the database stuff. A lot of it has moved into this single Nix expression, which is, it calls this Ruby env function and provides a specific package version of Ruby, provides a gemfile.lock, and then some extra packages that are required just in development mode to make things go. So that installs a lot faster and a little bit more, quite a bit more reliably than the legacy way of doing it. But this is really just like a UX and performance gain, right? Like this isn't a fundamentally different thing. Where this was our step one. We do have like some. Well, I mentioned Runic already. Runic is where this really gets taken to the next level. So we don't. I have a different thing. You will have. Well, maybe. If you bought stuff online in the last little while, you may have noticed Shop Pay is a thing. This is another Rails app that I'm just using as an example for this because it's a relatively smaller app that isn't, it's not as big, so things don't take quite as long. And it doesn't do nearly as much weird stuff as our 16-year-old monolith. So Pay. So previously, our dev YAML, the big configuration for development environments, looked like, let's see, dev show master dev YAML. Oh, git show. Geez, what am I thinking? Looked like this. So this will look kind of familiar from that core example. We have some stuff about git hooks. Okay, install some homebrew packages, install Ruby at some particular version, install Railgun, run a Railgun VM, do some stuff about Bundler, database, bootstrap, node packages, right? Okay, so we could have done the same thing we did with core, our like Shopify project, but what we did, or I mean, this is just a kind of prototype branch, but this is what we're doing, is the new dev YAML says Runic true, and then all of this stuff I can still run dev up, except I have to run my branch of dev. I can run dev up, and we will see I'm instantiating a Runic environment. And it's going to do a download or two, and we're done. So now if I do, let's say, which Ruby, let's see, that exists in my Runic environment. And again, unanswered question about environment that I'm going to talk about briefly. So let's look at that file that configures this. So where previously dev YAML was like fairly procedural, the idea with Runic is to make it much more declarative. So providing ways to make this configuration as generic as possible without requiring duplication across projects, and then thereby kind of like encouraging, doing a stronger job of encouraging kind of like conformality to a sort of standard, right? Because when you have this very abstract high-level declaration, you can look at this file and go, well, okay, so if this should have worked, all of this stuff is divergence, right? So there's an interesting aspect here about a slight pressure towards keeping projects more similar to each other, which is another really important thing when you have a large engineering organization with thousands of developers and thousands of projects. You really would like those to be as similar as possible to each other. And then that's also pressure for us to make this Runic tool handle, the like ideal standard, right? So here we're toggling on Rails, specifying some additional packages that we need. This actually doesn't need to be mentioned, but anyway. Some extra stuff about the project was renamed at one point, so now we've got like a different name from the one here. It's fine. Stuff about Git hooks, something about this tool we're using in development to interact with Kafka, and then some commands. So I didn't show you this in the original dev YAML, but there were a lot more commands than this, because every dev YAML tends to specify this is how you run a server, this is how you run a console, this is how you run tests. But like those should be inferable from the simple fact that you're running a Rails project, or whatever type of project you happen to be writing. We shouldn't have to specify that every time for every project. So what we've done now is had Runic is this Nix module system that is able to, by virtue of toggling on the Rails thing, provide commands for a Rails console and things like this. So if I now, I had actually meant to use a different branch of dev. Just bear with me for a second. We're going to run dev up again, and it's going to take probably 20 seconds. So, but we previously, you could declare, dev console, and then that would run the Rails console. But kind of we observed like there are lots of things that have consoles in a given project. So what if we, weren't tied down to, I'm just going to interrupt Yarn. What if I could run dev console and see, okay, well, you actually have a whole bunch of options here. Prototype. So you can run a Rails console, you can run a Ruby console, you can also run like a Redis console, right? So you infer all of this from the project config. And I'll show you a little bit about how Runic is put together and why this makes sense. I'm actually hoping to open source Runic semi-shortly when I have more time to get back to it. But yeah, I think this is a powerful concept. So if we go to the Runic, let's just talk about this now. I'm going to pause for questions at some point in fairly short order and try and direct the rest of this, but just a super brief overview of Runic. So this is a module system that uses a totally identical underpinning library to NixOS. It just happens that it shares absolutely none of the modules. So we have this module list file that specifies all of the modules available. And because I've been talking about Rails, let's go look at the Rails module. So for those who don't know, which is probably a lot of you, NixOS module is, and I'm sorry, I have to assume a little bit of familiarity with the language, but this defines a function. So a NixOS module is a function which returns ultimately an attribute set containing two attributes. One is options, and the other is config. So what happens when you evaluate a Nix module system is you kind of like slam all of the options together and provide that as like the total suite of options that are available to be configured. And then you take this config node and slam them all together and expect them to set a bunch of those option values. And there's kind of functional programming magic about resolving, all of the merge of that. But just to think of it as like options declares the stuff that you can set, and then config sets it all, right? So the real trick to see here is that, first off, dot is like just code for nested attribute set. So this is kind of the same as doing like options equals this is identical. So we declare this options.rim.framework.rails and give it an enable member. So that's then the enable toggle. And that's why in github.com Shopify pay Runic. Here we had Rails enable true. So this is the option we're setting. Now, config is importantly that we have this make if macro that basically says, if that enable thing was set, generate all this stuff, otherwise generate nothing. So this is how we're toggling the Rails rune on. And basically we're saying, okay, well, if Rails was specified as true, we want to turn on Ruby. We want to turn on JavaScript. We want to turn on Memcached, MySQL, Redis, ToxyProxy, and then some other stuff. Railgun, our little virtual machine runner. So, and then commands. So here's where we say, okay, well, here's a console command for Rails, right? So that is just run Rails console. And test is Rails test, right? But one of the cool things is we could actually do much more sophisticated stuff here, right? Like, for example, Core, our like Shopify project, has a much more sophisticated test runner that we use locally. This is a cool opportunity for us to take that out and provide it for free to all of our projects, which is something that we're looking to explore at some point too. So we could dive down into these progressively more detailed modules, runes. But the basic kind of flow here is that we kind of, I've been modeling this as a 3-tier system. We kind of have like up on top, we have runes, which is just a funny word I'm using for like the most abstract kind of definitions. Down on the bottom, we have outputs, which are kind of like, these are the actual files and, you know, like Nix outputs that we're generating from this stuff. And then in between, we have aspects, which are kind of the big plumbing tier of stuff flowing around and pushing data and functions and objects. So stuff tends to generally propagate downwards. When you turn the Rails rune on, it turns into like, well, we're going to turn the MySQL rune on. So if we look at that one, we'll see, okay, well, it's saying I want this MySQL client. I have a command for MySQL. But then here we see something kind of interesting that brings me back full circle to this environment thing, which is the last top level topic I want to talk about. We specify this thing where in the development environment, we want to set this variable MySQL URL, which is just that. And then that gets written into an environment. So we have this tool called shadowenv. Shadowenv is a lot like durenv, but it has some different trade-offs that we particularly like for our use case. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if I look at shadow and I have to go to an actual project that's using Runic. Shadowenv.d/ I think it's called 750 Runic. Yeah. So we've got some kind of generic preamble. Provide. You'll notice when I changed into this directory, I saw activated shadowenv with Ruby 266 and Node 1021. Provide is just a little like informative tag that allows it to generate that message. It doesn't actually do anything. And then we kind of do some stuff about activating our Runic environment. So we have this environment variable Runic environment that's set to the Nix store path. We prepend that to path, man path, and package config path. Do some real weird gorp about Ruby, just because Ruby is a special snowflake. It does a whole bunch of environment stuff. But then, importantly, for all of the things that are actually in our Nix development environment, profile, whatever you want to call it, we recurse into those and run their setup hook. So this setup hook is actually a file that I will show you. This is a bash script, essentially. And when you run Nix shell, which is how most people would run these development environments, that gets sourced into the shell as you run it. So you literally export railgun config equals this value. With shadowenv, we compile that into our little custom Lisp format. And then this gets executed every time you enter into the directory. Very similar to durenv. But because it's this compiled target, we can be more confident that it's fast enough that we don't have to worry about async evaluation. And yeah, we have this transformer that just takes all these setup hooks, turns them into Lisp, and concatenates them into this shadowenv file. And then that's the gist, I guess. I think maybe now let's get to questions. Yeah.
Sorry, I was like, when can I pull that like thing out to like get this started for people? So the first question we have is from Michael, and he's asking, are you using Nix on all machines running Catalina?
Yes. At least I think everyone's on Catalina. But yes, everybody that's using Catalina essentially that is also running our code ever is using Nix. We have I can actually post this in a comment. We have
that'd be great.
Yeah, the code won't be immediately usable for you because it's all like using dev's internal structures and stuff. But that is the gist, and it includes all the right commands to run. It's awesome. In chat.
Okay,
but it is a lot of like weird crap that you have to do to make it work. It's unfortunate, but it does work.
Next up, we have Drew asking 80% speed up in dev environment over installing software with Homebrew. That's the question. Clarification.
Yeah, so that also includes gems. So it's kind of like there's like an averaging effect there. It is faster than Homebrew, probably not 80% faster, but I don't have an exact number there. It's easy with Nix to do like say 16-way parallel, and all it's doing is just grabbing a tarball and untarring it into a directory without worrying about anything else. And like Homebrew bottles are essentially the same thing, but as far as I've understood, it does it sequentially. Maybe there's some flag to make it do it in parallel, but I'm not aware.
The next question, I am terrible with names, so I'm not even going to attempt to try and butcher this. I'm sorry. So how often do devs actually have to interact with Nix and really understand Nix concepts, especially when needing to pull in external dependencies that don't follow your project structure?
Mm-hmm. Currently never, because Runic isn't really deployed. So the idea though is to find a level of abstraction that users will have to be like, kind of vaguely familiar with the Nix syntax, though I would expect they should be able to figure it out just from context of looking at the file they're editing. But we need to craft this situation where we provide kind of the basic bits that they need and show lots of examples of like how to customize that when they need to, because obviously we don't want to like have to teach developers like thousands of hours worth of like loading the full context of Nix into their brains just to do their work. So yeah, there's this balancing act of treating it as a project configuration DSL versus the whole ecosystem.
Cool, thank you. Christian would like to know, I use ASDF version manager to manage multiple languages and database versions. What's the comparison there?
Mm-hmm. So I would say ShadowEnv is more generic and less automated. So the concept with Nix and ShadowEnv is that Nix gives you this flexibility to like say set this environment when you enter a Nix shell or whatever. And with ShadowEnv, you can do really any manipulation to your environment you would want to, but we specifically transform just those setup hooks. So while ASDF is tuned, as far as I understand, to like look for the common ways of setting various language runtimes from the files that exist in the repo, conventionally like .ruby version and whatever, like our setup doesn't do that at all. It kind of like is more opinionated about the way you're setting up that project, because we are in this sort of like not closed ecosystem, but we control our ecosystem somewhat, and we can have some opinions about how developers are specifying their projects and their dependencies.
Cool, thank you. The next question was actually asked during your Railgun part of the demo, so keep that in mind when I ask it. Mm-hmm. And Helmi asks, are those Nix OS containers?
No. It's so dumb. Yeah, it's like actually built as it's complicated. It's built as like one big Docker container on an Ubuntu base image, and then exported into a Squash FS and distributed via some like binary update scheme, and it's just all weird. It's not any normal technology. I actually built it at the same time as Docker was building Docker for Mac, and then we met up at DockerCon. We were like, we built the same thing, except mine has no features.
Oh my god. Okay, let's move on from that one.
Yeah.
Cervello asks, does Runic have any relation to the work by Vandenberg on declarative process manager and agnostic deployment framework?
It does not, but I saw that recently and was very intrigued by it because I think it would be really useful to integrate something like that into Runic, because a big unfilled void is like, how do we manage this constellation of processes? Like, we can put stuff on disk, but Nix and currently Runic doesn't have a really obvious answer for like, okay, now you want to start processes and you want several of them running to interact. Like, what shape does that take? So I think there's a really strong chance we're going to be looking at that project.
Great. Next one is from Derek, and is Runic open source or an internal tool? And you kind of mentioned that you want to open source it, didn't you?
Yeah, so currently it's internal. It's just like prototype quality right now. But I really hope to open source it. I think like I have hoped to open source dev for the last several years, but it just grew to be so like ad hoc and Shopify specific that to actually like extract the core, it was just going to be a crazy effort. I'm thinking like I would like to maybe even soon like make Runic public and start working on it in the open, because we have a fairly limited amount of Nix expertise at this company, and it would be great to get like informed external opinions on it. I think there could be a lot of fun collaborating on that.
Awesome. Our next question is from Jorge, and it's kind of long. I don't know if you can read it, but I'll read the whole thing out. So the first question is, why not use Nix OS instead of Nix OS Darwin? Then, as an addition to the part, there's a quote from Eelco. Realistically, this may force us to drop support for Mac OS. Using a different store location for Mac OS would require a separate binary cache and a separate Hydra instance, and there would be no guarantee that the new location wouldn't break in the future. I did notice in the talk that it's still possible to make the system volume writable, but not in a persistent way. And then there's a link to a GitHub issue that most people should be able to see in the chat.
Yes, I've posted on that issue multiple times. So we do weird stuff. Like, it is, I guess I still have my screen here. I can show you. Like, we have this, you have to, this is an amusing rabbit hole. So like you have to write a thing to synthetic.conf and essentially reboot your machine. And then it creates this Nix directory at the root for you. At which point you can like create an APFS volume. So you do like disk util list, and then you've got this like APFS volume, and then you have to enable file vault, and you have to disable metadata indexing. It's like this whole, like, I get why people are frustrated by this, but we already have this tool called dev that does like just insane amounts of system configuration for people. So it's like relatively easy. You can see that gist I posted earlier up for at least the list of commands to run, but I don't anticipate it's going to drop macOS support really. I think probably I should spend some time working on the Nix OS, or like the Nix the Nix installer for Darwin to like see if I can wrap up what we've done cleanly, because I suspect we're doing this better than anyone. But yeah, it works. It's just a pain to set up. As far as whether we should be using Nix OS, like, I'd like to, but we can only change so many things at a time in our development environments. But one of the things that really appeals to me about Nix is it kind of unbinds us from this strong dependency on macOS, right? We've had dev tools that have assumed macOS for such a long time that if we really rebase everything on top of Nix, it makes it way easier to run this same stuff on macOS, Linux, Windows. Even with WSL2 seems to run Nix just fine. Move it to the cloud, run it locally, whatever. So that is part of the motivation, really.
Great, thanks. Drew has a question. What framework is that from your dev CLI tool for the pretty updatable output?
Aha, yes, that is open source. What is it called? CLI UI. So we have this project. I guess I was going to open this in my browser, but I'm not sharing that tab. Anyway, yeah, it's Shopify/CLI UI on GitHub. It's a pretty simple little Ruby code base, and I would recommend checking it out. It's pretty cool. We also have a companion CLI kit for building fast Ruby command line tools. Basically, the key here is using autoload extensively and just deferring evaluation of as much as possible, because Ruby can be quite slow to boot if you load all your code up front, but dev is relatively fast. It takes that long, so yeah.
Great. We'll try and get links to those. If you can dig up the links to those repos and post them in the chat, that'd be awesome, Bert. As you're answering this question, I know you can multitask. Nebez asks, can you expand on the shell?
The shell. Oh, I mean, just like my personal shell. Yeah, I mean, I've my dot files are public, but I have a highly customized prompt, and it's written in C or Go or something. I can't remember. It's insane.
So just
check out. I'm just like Burke on GitHub. You'll find my dot files repo somewhere.
Okay, our next question is from Mike. How do the explicit and detailed derivations used for the development map the versions of dependencies for these projects that are used in a production environment? Are they bundled to the same artifact, for example, a container image, or fulfilled out of band?
So this is, there's a couple answers to this. One is it's kind of like it's still a prototype and we haven't really pushed too far into building images and stuff yet. So as far as tying development to production versions, I anticipate kind of like we'll probably have some extra metadata to specify when you say a project, like a package, like this is relevant in which environments, right? And the default will probably be all of them. As far as pinning versions, this is something that in general like is not done as aggressively in Nix as it is in many environments, because you kind of hope that since everything is built holistically, divergence will be surfaced earlier, and you can have tooling that verifies versions out of band. But like most generally, we just haven't got to that point yet. We don't really know.
Okay. The next question is from Derek. So Runic is basically providing the Nix OS functionality on OS X. Is there a reason why not to just use Nix OS and the benefit from the standard tooling?
Yes. So Runic looks a lot like Nix OS, but it's not Nix OS. Nix OS configures a system essentially, and of course you can do like sub environments and stuff in it too. But that's not the focus of Runic. The focus of Runic is to give you a module-based system to declare a project and all of the uniqueness that comes along with like describing a project. So bringing into focus the actual uniqueness of project configuration rather than system configuration. And the outputs won't just be like NixOS systems or NixOS containers or things like that. The outputs will also include like Kubernetes manifests, like CI pipelines for our build kite stuff. Like all of these different types of artifacts, configuration files, like with our Railgun configuration is an output of that project configuration right now, because we're able to completely derive the information we need to pass to Railgun from the simple fact that it's a Rails app with such and such an address and port and things like this. So I don't know if that answered the question. But
hopefully, if
not,
so. Derek, like pop back in there and re-clarify for what Burke didn't explain. Next question is from Tyler. How does Runic interpret Rails.nix file into a Nix derivation?
Okay, so I can show this a little more clearly. So let's trace this let's trace this from the outside in. So ultimately, Runic has this file lib.nix, which is the actual thing that gets evaluated at the outermost level. And basically what it returns is, there's a lot of like adornment around this, but basically it's returning final outputs. And then we have this final outputs file that provides an option called final outputs and no associated configuration. But this is the little like tree on which we hang the things that we want to be actually generatable from a Runic installation or module evaluation. I think it's called environment default. So here in this module called environment, which you'll see is like output as opposed to rune or aspect, meaning it's the bottom tier that actually generates stuff. We associate something to final outputs.environment, which is the derivation at this, option path. And that is basically the result of calling packages build-env with the name Runic environment and whatever packages we have specified. So basically bubbling through the whole hierarchy, what we're essentially doing in terms of the window through which we view this being the development environment, we're essentially modifying config aspect packages includes, config output environment extra paths, and config output environment activation script text. And that's how that works.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another question from Jorge. Is Runic a Mac OS only tool, or does it make sense to use it in its current state on NixOS?
There's a strong chance it only works on Mac OS, but it's meant to work on everything. If it only works on Mac OS, it's probably one line or two that needs to be changed. Actually, I think somebody has been running it on NixOS yeah, no, it works on NixOS.
There you go. Next question is from Mike. I see a lot of hard-coded derivations in this shadow env config. How do you keep everything up to date? Presumably, you need to chase recent version of Rails at least.
Yeah. So okay. First of all, let's go to pay. So when we look here, these like GeoLite 2, MySQL Client 5.7, V8. Well, V8's not even a version, but like these change very infrequently. As far as hard-coded versions, most of the stuff that changes with any regularity, I won't show you our gem file .lock maybe, but basically we have gems are bundled. We use a feature that's like often referred to as import from derivation. So where I'll have to show you this in Runic. Ruby? No, I'm not going to dig this up. Anyway, we on the fly, we convert the gem file.lock. We tear it out into like a million different derivations to fetch the SHA sums for each gem mentioned, and then reconstitute it into a gemset.nix. And that gets evaluated to like build a gem bundle of all of the actual gems in the bundle. So developers, just like they always have, run like bundle lock or whatever, or bundle update to update their gems, and then that sort of just transparently works still. As far as hard-coded derivations, there's like not really so many, and the ones that are tend to be just like the head references in Nix packages. So we use we pin Nix packages to a particular release, and we bump this ourselves manually, so we have a little bit of control over when things roll out. But basically, we track unstable or maybe even master with just some latency. Unstable, I think it is. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's what I got.
Okay, next is Alessandro. Do you have a shared cache / substituter? How is it populated?
Yes. So yeah. So we have a shared cache. We did insanity to make it work, because the only real reliable credential we have for people is Google Cloud Google Cloud Platform, but I guess, Google Cloud Platform. So we do some crazy stuff with a local Nginx proxy that translates that into something that looks like S3 or whatever. Anyway, we have a shared cache that resolves locally that people check. Then we have a post-build hook that when people finish running DevUp in a Shopify project, it uploads it to the cache. That's not really the final shape I want this to take. It's kind of sketchy from a security perspective. What we really need to be doing is building it in CI infrastructure and pushing that out. And that's something that we're going to get around to soon.
Thank you. Shyam asks, do you also use Nix in production?
Not yet. I'm hoping that we will by the end of this year. Now that we have development environments constructed from Nix expressions, like taking the next step to turn that into a container is really appealing, because typically, like, especially for Rails apps with the whole bundle install step and whatnot, container builds are like, the models just don't work together very well. So the idea of simply exporting a subgraph of the Nix store as a container is really intensely appealing, because it could speed that up a lot and provide a little bit better, auditability and vulnerability scanning, things like this. So not yet, soon, hopefully.
Okay, so we have a question from Michael, and I kind of ties into this one. He's asked, is Nix being used currently just for developer environments? And I'm assuming the question is yes.
Currently, yes.
And are you considering using Nix to manage production artifacts?
Yes.
Yes.
Not like we don't have, like, the project is not like underway or anything, but it's like definitely on my like mental model of this is where I think this is headed within the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then finally, have you considered using Nix to manage / test production VMs deploys using OpenNix / DisNix?
I have not really thought about it yet. NixOps, like, in the little bit of experimentation I've done with it, I was really turned off by the fact that it needs a like shared state database across all of its users. Like, obviously we have a large team of people who would be interacting with deployments. And so, I mean, it's plausible that we could put that shared state database on our like deployment tool, but then it still just feels like a kind of sketchy paradigm for a system this large. But I mean, yeah, we should look into it more at least.
Cool. Okay, we are coming close to the end. We're going to take two more questions. There are some other questions left over, and we will address those and put them with the update of the video. So don't think we're ignoring all you guys that we didn't get your questions today. So keep putting them in the chat. We will answer them. So next up is Walker. How did you arrive at the 3-tiered model for your system?
Totally arbitrary, and I'm totally open to like reevaluation too. Yeah, it was kind of just an initial observation that like some of it was highly abstract, like just declaring a fact about your project kind of. Some of it was really like the last mile of generating, like cobbling together a couple different things and building an output. And some of it was plumbing, basically. So that's how. I mean, but it's not set in stone, not engraved in stone at all.
Okay, and the last question now is from Billy. Is Nix used primarily for Rails projects, or are we using it for backend services as well?
Mm-hmm. So currently, just Rails, because I've been like really building on our like core monolith as the big testing ground, like do the hard thing first thing. Our oldest, most complex project felt like the right place to start. Though I have kind of like got it working, like for example, on a Go project almost adequately, but then I had to do other work. Like, yeah, it's really easy to add other frameworks and like project what's the word? Like, I don't know, configurations, but we just haven't built out any other than the most complex one yet. Mobile is going to be a little challenging, right? Because they're really locked into their own ecosystems. So I'm not sure what shape that'll take yet. I have to figure out what to do to facilitate that best.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Burke, for coming here and answering all the questions, doing a lot of like demos. There is going to be a copy of this webinar posted on the engineering blog, so keep your eyes updated. I will also send all of our attendees an email of when that's available. Burke's videos, he's going to be updating some videos for you. So if you had the link to his playlist, you'll get that. We're hiring from anywhere now as we've moved to digital by default principles. So check out our available engineering positions. Finally, I want to thank all of you guys for coming out and joining us this afternoon. I know it's Memorial Day for our American friends. Sorry, we put this on a holiday because we did want to do it on ours. But I hope you have a really great day. It's beautiful in Toronto. I'm sure it's beautiful out in Ottawa where you are too, Burke. And also we'll be sending you a survey that won't be blocked this time if you came to our last one. We want to know how to make this better. We want to know what we're doing, and we want to know what topics you want to hear from us. So thank you all for coming. Have a great afternoon, and we'll chat later. Goodbye.
Thank you.